Hey there, this is Meg Riley here in the ice rink of Minneapolis. It thawed yesterday and refroze, and I'm telling you, you just skate on all the sidewalks right now. It's a little bit scary, but sunny and warm, and I'm hoping for some more melting to take place. Christina, how about you? What's going on where you are?
I am in Charlottesville, Virginia, where today it's 70 degrees projected. Yeah, it's just, but there is no climate change. It's like supposed to be 70 and 60 and then maybe some snow on Saturday. Who knows?
And this is Michael Tino in Peekskill, New York. It's good to be here. Spring is springing here in New York, hopefully not prematurely on February 15th. I've noticed that my crocuses have pushed their little sprouts up above the soil. For those of you who don't know me out there in VUU land, I mark my year. Like my New Year celebration is when the first crocus in my yard blooms. It is a very, very important holiday for me. So I keep track every year, and I will post a picture to Facebook as soon as that crocus blooms. But they're about that tall now.
Now, does your daughter celebrate that holiday with you?
She will, yeah.
Excellent. And we have Jessica Star Rockers, who also provides tech support, tweets, puts links up, and other important things. Jessica, how is it where you are today?
Well, I was just remarking to Wendy about how now I can look out the window and see that it's beginning to be light outside, which is exciting for me. So, yay! Look, there it is. And I'm on Twitter with hashtag the VUU, VUU spelled VUU, and on Facebook and all the places. So meet me there.
Yeah, meet her there, and we really hope that viewers will ask questions, participate, and be part of the conversation. Someone told me that the light changes more in February than any other month, something about how the Earth isn't round. And I am certainly observing that here. I love it. At 5:30, it's still light, and so at the end of the day, it just feels like a little bonus thing going on that I just love because, in the middle of winter, by 4 o'clock, it's just dark. So yeah, it's a blessing. I'll say that. Well, today we're going to be talking, these are complicated times we're in, and there are a lot of really complex conversations going on. And we've invited the Reverend Wendy Von Courter. Oh, nope, I got it wrong. She used to be. Wait a minute, I'm going to get it right. The Reverend Wendy Von Courter from the UU Congregation of Marblehead, who has been navigating some pretty choppy waters publicly and with complexity, and we wanted her to come and tell the story of what's been going on in her congregation as we really explore what civil discourse looks like in a very uncivil time that we're living in, where I think everybody is a little on edge because so many communities are under such violent and vicious attack. And so, Wendy, I'm going to just let you tell the story your own way because it's a complicated story and my framing might mess it up. So just going to invite you to just tell us what's been going on in your congregation.
Sure. Let me give it a try because it is a complicated story, and I think you also have a link you can share later for people who want to see it in a more scripted manner too. That's all chronological. But let me sort of set the scene by saying that we landed in a very challenging time period that took much more time and much more soul than any of us anticipated. And as a backdrop to this, and so let me say what it was first so people aren't wondering, and that is that we chose to show a movie called The Occupation of the American Mind. And it's a documentary by a professor, a number of people out in UMass Amherst, and it looks at how the narrative of the Israeli-Palestine conflict is delivered in the United States and how that differs from where it's shown elsewhere. And without getting into whether you believe that that's propaganda or not, I'm now going to backdrop to say this is not something that I've had no interaction with. One of the most formative experiences for me just very briefly came when I was doing my MDiv down at Boston University. And I came out of the student union one night just grabbing a coffee. And this was probably it was in the early 2000s, and came out, and there was a whole row of tables set up with students behind them and poster boards full of horrific images. And to this day, I can't remember whether those were students from Israel or students from Palestine, but the images were really horrible. And I stopped. I was late to class because I was compelled to sort of just stop and witness and see them all. And then either a day or two later, back again in the same setting, I noticed a police presence on the campus. And, it was substantial enough that one would notice it. Again, went to get coffee, and again came through that same corridor. And this time there weren't just one row of tables, but on the opposite side of the corridor was another row with the other students. And so on one side you had students who were connected to Israel, and the other side you had students who were connected to Palestine. And the images were the same. And the pain in the students' eyes were the same. And so again, I was late because I just stopped to witness it all. And later on, I went and I sat sort of at the feet of one of my mentors and said, how do you as a religious leader, how do you walk with this? And it was right after the Passover bombings. And he talked about what it would be like to call, he was a name dropper. So he said, it's time for me to call Jesse, meaning Jesse Jackson, these other folks, and to walk back, go back to Jerusalem, knowing that, and walk arm in arm, knowing some of us won't return. And that story took me to other hard places that I've been, a jail in Arizona. So that sort of was my first connection with some of the complexities of the issue of the conflict. Then I will say as a backdrop that UUCM, the Unitarian Universalist Church of Marblehead, is also not shy about controversy. They were a sanctuary long before I was there for Vietnam conscientious objectors. They were on the leading edge of some of the issues around marriage equality in Massachusetts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's not been new to us. We, during my time there, took a lot of heat when we started becoming a host family for a group called Family Promise, a host church for that, and there were lies spread about how we were opening a homeless shelter. And so we have been on the receiving end of some real scrutiny in town. And that sort of becomes an important context for this story. So this story, and we also had a group that's very, very connected to fighting for peace in the Middle East, and are very connected to the oppression of the Palestinian people. And that's because of their own trips that they've taken there. And so I've been going to different events throughout the years as a way to support them in that and to educate myself more about, again, the complexities. So sometime early this fall, they said we'd like to show this film as part of what we call our Meeting House series, where we've done things on
that committee
the Social Action Committee, which is it's probably about a third of our church is on the Social Action Committee. And they engage with all sorts of different things. And so they, the people that are most connected to this issue, and also the chair of that committee, and the same people came and said, we'd like to show this film. And would you go and take a look at it? And I did. I watched the whole thing. You can watch it online as long as you don't mind the word preview behind it. And I can provide that link to anyone who wants it. And I watched and I said, this is an important story. I agree we should show it. And then they asked me via an email sometime later, would you be willing to moderate it? And I, of course, responded, I'd be delighted. And those words I've been questioned many, many times since then, saying, are you still delighted? And delighted's the wrong word, but I will tell you as this story unfolded that I feel privileged, as difficult as it be. So we set this in motion. We had, this was both good and bad. We had an amazing person doing the publicity for us. And she was so good that the word really got out far and wide. And so my two rabbinical colleagues first wrote to me, and they said, surely you won't let this disturbing thing happen. One of these, I've been there 12 years now, and one of these colleagues I've known that long, and he's served, I think, 25 years or more in Marblehead. Another of them was newer. And the language that they used actually likened us doing this to allowing a member from the KKK to come and present in our church, or allowing somebody who was very anti-LGBT, I don't think they used the word Q, but the intent was there, to come and speak at our church. The language was very, very strong, and the pressure intense. And I wrote back very respectfully and said, you know, we come to a different conclusion, and thanking them, but that we would be going ahead and showing it, and that we were certainly sorry for any pain and distress that was causing them. And if it had just remained there, that would be in keeping with another time we showed something, that there was a respectful engagement where both people spoke their views, but then we carried on. But it didn't stop there. Within, I think, days, we were hearing from a gentleman from the Lappin Foundation, that's Lappin. And Mr. Lappin, this is a group that started the birthright trips to Israel. And he's a very, very wealthy and very influential man on the North Shore of Boston. Influential not just in the Jewish community, where his foundation funds many, many things, but also in the business community because of the property that he owns and the relationships that he has with business owners. And that became evident, we think, when we saw how some of this was covered in the news. And he wrote and wanted to meet with me, and I put it, I agreed to meet with him, but it was close to the day of the film. It was, I think, 2 days before it. And he got very angry that we wouldn't meet with him sooner, and expressed that anger in words, and then expressed it with a threat of, if you don't pull out, we are going to run this full-page ad in the paper. And the full-page ad, it's much longer than this, but it did these things. It basically called me and the church anti-Semitic, very clearly. You know, why would a church show an anti-Semitic film? It then pretty much condemned all Palestinian people, not just some Palestinian people, but all. And it, again, he was very well funded. So he said, if you show this film, we will run this ad, and here are all the signers that we have to it. And we again responded with respect and sorrow that people were upset by it, but here's why we do it. And that's in keeping with our values, that we are seekers of truth and seekers of information, even when they might be competing truths. And I think that's one of the things where we have the hardest time, is how do we let this, competing, very different truths. We see this in our anti-racism work. We see it in everything I think we do as Unitarian Universalists. I think we're much better at saying, oh yeah, you can think different things, but getting the competing truths, or the different ways of looking at the same events, and making sure that there's space for all of those in the same room, I think we are not as skilled at times. And so we let him know, and then he did come to visit us and said hateful things to us in our sacred space. And once again said that all Palestinian people were bad. They throw people who are gay off roofs. They do horrible things to their women. And it was just very difficult to sit in there and to watch him accuse our social action folks too. And we had people who are Jewish in the community who were very supportive of us showing this, who had at this point come into the conversation as well. And he attacked them as well. So everybody that had any wish to show this film was being labeled very publicly anti-Semitic. And at that point, we started getting copies. So the posters were printed, the full-page ads were printed in several papers, and we started to get hate mail. And the mail, I think I have folders that if you stack them all up, we got about this much. We just got another one last week. Most of them, the majority, were copies of that same ad. So he was using his network, and I just sort of went down the rabbit hole of a few to see where they were coming from, and they were all over the country. But some of them were even more disturbing. And so we started separating them. They're the ones that we have to send to the police also. Those went into one folder. And this is not something I've been accustomed to doing. But at the same time, I was also meeting with some of my rabbinical colleagues, not those that were so in such opposition, but those who actually thought that it was a good thing to do. And I was really afforded some hard, difficult conversations with them through tears, where they told me how they couldn't talk about it in their synagogues and their families, but they were also able to tell me and help me understand more of why it was such an emotional reaction, and why it was such a reaction in which, from my perspective, facts didn't matter. There was nothing that I could say that would matter other than, okay, we won't show this film. And that was really difficult. So it sort of led me to sort of look at, well, not why we won't show the film, because we were committed to doing that, but how can we open up our conversation space to let some of those voices in, and perhaps carve, in small part even, a way forward for this very, very difficult and loaded conversation to happen in a community in which there are so many Jewish people present. And so at this point, and I'm sorry this takes long to describe, but it was it was so layered. At the same time as I was sort of coming to better understandings about this, I was also at home watching the movie over and over again, because I thought, oh my God, moderating this is, I'm going to have to be an expert on something that I really feel that has not been my area of concentration. And so I better really know more about this. And so I was not getting a whole lot of sleep, I will tell you, during probably a 2-month period. So if I had any communications with any of you during that time, just forgive me. But at this point, it got the attention of the executive producer, Sud Jali, and the directors, Jeremy Earp and Loretta Alper. I don't recall her last name at the moment, and they changed their plans so that they could be with us on that day. And that was huge, because at that point I thought, all right, I'm going to have the people in the house for whom this is their issue, and they know this, and they can speak and with credibility about all of this. I can just focus on process, and that's my area of expertise. And that really made it a lot easier for me, because at the same time, I'm also being questioned by all of our social action folks who were so apologetic. They're like, because I became the target. It was, Bryn, you're a stupid, stupid woman. You're a Nazi. You will get yours in the afterlife. This is the first time I think I've been able to repeat some of those things without tearing up, because it was very upsetting. And it was also, at the same time as being upsetting, it was an opportunity to also listen to the voices of anti-Semitism in our communities, what it looks, these signs on the way to dropping off my child at school. And so for this white privileged gal, who grew up not having to experience that, I was aware that that was also happening too. And for some of our Muslim friends and siblings in the community, we're hearing from them thanking us, but it was also sort of a taste of the hatred that's out there. And as you mentioned earlier, Meg, that there's this rise. There's this bit about how, now it seems condoned to have more hate going on. And so this continued, and what we did was came up with a way that we were going to show this, that we thought would not accommodate, that we thought would allow those who were angriest into a process in which they would know that they would be protected and able to speak their truths as well. And so there's a lot more to this. There were letters to the editor, there were strategizing meetings and all of that. There were meetings with the police to walk through our space and talk about safety. And at the same time as I was doing that, I was also learning that from some of my rabbinical colleagues that they do that every Sunday. And so does the mosque. So all of this was in this very, very intense mix. And then the night, and people were walking me to my car. And that felt very odd to me as well. And we checked the panic buttons that we had in place and found out that they didn't work. And so we got the panic buttons all checked. We had to cover a paid police detail. And then the night of the event actually arrived. And communications to the congregation went out to say, here's what's happening, because they were facing it. There were people that were going to the Jewish Community Center and being put on the spot to, why are you people doing this? Why are you letting this anti-Semitic film into your space? And we were also hearing quieter voices from people saying, thank you for doing this. We're frustrated that we can't have this conversation in our temple and in our families. So all of this leads to the night of the event. And the movie, by the way, is 85 minutes. So it's not really one that lends itself to doing a lot afterwards, right? But we had the film. There were protesters outside. There were also people holding up signs in support, and none of those signs appeared in the papers at all. And a few lead articles appeared in the paper that, although they interviewed us, including in the Boston Globe, although they interviewed us at length, none of what we said, or very little of what we said, we being me, the Social Action Committee, some of the strongest Jewish voices in the community for the film, very little of that appeared, which was a very frustrating thing. And it did not escape our notice. It was proving the point of the film. Because the point of the film was, as soon as you criticize the state of Israel, we will use, you will very swiftly be shut down. And that was, in fact, what was being tried, was in effect in motion against us. So the night came, the protesters were there. I stood outside with my goal, and I was in communication with the police, and there were 5 police people there, including somebody who was undercover and inside the sanctuary, and including the police chief. And there was a lot of yelling at us, and we just kept reminding people not to engage and to be polite and to welcome anybody in. And they did come in, and then the movie was shown. And in the very beginning, I sort of set the tone by saying, in much more words, but basically, if you are here with hate in your heart for our Jewish siblings, we stand and sit against you, and we will work against the rise of anti-Semitism. And it also noted the historic context, that this does come in a historic context where people were, it was tried to be annihilated, and then moved on to, and if you come here with hatred in your heart for our Palestinian siblings, we'll work against that, and noted the rise of Islamophobia as well. And then just encouraged people to be there with open hearts and minds, and that after the film, that the executive producer would do a Q&A. And then after that, we would move into the room next door to this and have it's actually a fishbowl exercise, but I co-opted the term listening circles, which is a different process, but I thought fishbowl would take too many words to explain. And so I said there'll be 2 concentric circles. And in the inner circle, we will invite people who are opposed to the film to sit, and others will be in the outer circle, and those in the inner circle will be able to speak and share their truths uninterrupted, and then we'd reverse the process. So the film then started, and I had all these backup plans in mind, like, what if somebody kicks over the projector? What will I do? And what if somebody does this or that? And none of that happened. I actually was able to go into my office and clean it, having now seen the movie 18 times. And so you could hear a pin drop. It was standing room only. We made sure to create space, especially for those who were protesting it, as long as signs were left outside so that they could come into the building as well. And then the executive producer answered questions for about 45 minutes. He received a standing ovation after that. That also didn't appear in the papers. And then we moved into the adjunct room to do the listening circles. And I will say too, during the question and answer period, because I had control over process and the microphone, there were people that wanted to yell and were yelling, and I would get over to them as quickly as possible and remind them to quiet down. And then they would be given the microphone. So, I wanted them to stop yelling so that their questions could be heard and that they would get an answer. Most of their questions, I would say, and I haven't reviewed all of the film, but most of their questions, it seemed to me, were about, why aren't you showing all the good that Israel does, as opposed to asking about the premise that the directors and the producer actually had, which was about how the narrative is shaped and how it is shared with us, as opposed to how it is done in other parts of the world. And then the listening circles, people participated. They were given 15 minutes to share first why they thought that the movie shouldn't be shown. And then afterwards, we switched and why people thought that it should be shown. And about half of the people who were in the circle for that second part were Jewish members of the community as well. After that, I thought we would be sort of done, but the hatred continued. I did outreach to both of the rabbis and met with them separately, and the more senior rabbi and I decided that we would send out a joint letter. And then Mr. Lappin accused us of having a false friendship and wrote nasty things. Once again, the things that he had shared privately with us about all Palestinian people, he actually printed. And I would say that the letters and statements that we saw in the papers after the film was shown many more were positive than were negative. And so what I took from this sort of at the end, and I'll just stop after I say this so people can ask questions, but what I took from this at the end and what I felt very good about in terms of our process is that we kept hearing stories from people who were having conversations because of the film and because of, I think, the way that we modeled the conversation that they hadn't had to have before, that they hadn't been able to have before, and they were people that didn't agree. And so I think all in all, at the end of this, I think that we were able to hold up a way of having one of the most difficult conversations of our time. We're not able to have this conversation easily at General Assembly. So I think that now I'm going to just stop there because I feel like I've given way too much information and probably left out something that you can now ask me about.
Well, thank you. I mean, that was a long story. You can see why I didn't want to try to summarize it in introduction. But, you know, it's a great case study for all of us, I think, in terms of, you know, as you say, both those communities, the Jewish and the Muslim communities, are under attack, violent attack right now. And I have experienced, even with very close Jewish friends, now I hang out with the Jewish Voices for Peace folks. I've learned a lot of what I know from them, but I know Jewish couples who can't talk about this between each other. And so I think there are a lot of families, and you haven't mentioned AIPAC, but that's the lobby group that when I was in Washington took out a number of people in like rural Alabama. I mean, just could take out anybody. And it was often members of the Congressional Black Caucus who were speaking out and got removed from office by a very aggressive lobbying group that really didn't allow any discussion about anything that Israel ever did, which, as I understand it, is not the case in Israel. In Israel, people do critique and discuss, and right, I haven't seen this movie, but that seems really true. So if you had to say 3 things you learned from this, from that whole story, what would you say are your takeaways?
Oh, what a great question. Wow. 3 things that I learned about this was, one is the importance of process, because no matter what, there was, I mean, there are people that tried, but I think that they didn't have any credibility when they tried to criticize the process. The second is that this is a space my faith calls me into. You know, there were so many people along the way that said, well, you know, do you want to just back down? And it's like, it was very clear to me. As clear to me as it was in an Arizona jail that this is where we're called to be, and this messiness, and all the more so with the opposition. I saw the power of AIPAC in this, and the ADL organizations, and how it's used to harm people and shut down dialogue. So the first would be the importance of good process, and the second is that this is where our faith calls us to be, and the third one is, you mentioned Jewish Voices for Peace, and so the third one I'll say, and then let me just explain a little bit about it, is that the importance of showing up as allies. And in this case, we didn't have many that had UU attached to them. is that we heard from exactly one UU congregation who sent flowers. And again, not everybody knew that this was going on, but a lot of people knew that it was going on. And so I was getting some quiet support here or there. And Jewish Voices for Peace were one of them. I just was able to meet with, and the UUJME, so UU's for Justice in the Middle East. They were very swift in coming out. We had some folks from Cambridge come, Peter Lauber, Diana Diggs, a number of people that showed up, and it made such a difference, and it should have been more. And so I'm now committed. I just went to a clergy meeting with the Jewish Voices for Peace put on, and I'm committed to making sure, that's one of the reasons we shared our story and are sharing it here today, is that other people ought to be able to do this, and they ought to be able to do it with a lot more support, and they ought to be able to do it with a lot more support that's Unitarian Universalists. So that's the third thing, the importance of allyship.
We have somebody asking in the YouTube channel, Alan Kellum. Thank you, Alan. What can be done at GA to begin the conversation? You mentioned that it's not a conversation we've been able to have in a meaningful way at GA. I have found the plenaries excruciating where anything related to Israel comes up, and it feels like the absolute wrong place to try to do it, in my opinion. Now that you've really looked at the process necessary, and you've done a lot of process observation at GA about
I have
years, so I'm curious if you have thoughts about that.
And I guess I might come to a different conclusion than you about it being the place or not, because I think that's another place that we've shut it down really effectively. And I point to when the UUJME and others had put, I don't know if it's a resolution or statement of one of those things, right? One of those acronyms about divestment. And what happened? The very opening plenary, our then president allowed a rabbi who was to bring greetings, a rabbi who was known to speak out about this and had done so in large assemblies. And he came right out and told everybody in the plenary hall why they had better vote against it. And that was crushing to those people. And again, that's not to say that we should have voted for it or against it, but in terms of shutting down dialogue. So I actually, as you asked that question out of the way, because it's been broken. And we've had some very strong voices and powerful people that have probably helped that happen. And so I think that we need to find ways to have the conversation.
Within a plenary hall, you think?
I think that we need to make sure that if the conversation is happening in our GA process, which includes congregational study, that we sure as heck have to make sure that we do not use the power of GA then to shut it down. And that's what I saw happen. And so what if that hadn't happened, Meg? You know, we might have had a much more thoughtful conversation in many assemblies. Again, I don't remember what that process was, but it was crushing to those who were trying hard to have that. So,
yeah,
I think that, Wendy, one of the things that that your story highlights for me is how we can model these conversations in our congregations. And I think until we learn how to model these conversations in our congregations on the small scale, to try and do it at General Assembly might be folly. And sometimes General Assembly leads us. Like learning how to do it on the big scale pushes our congregations into being able to do things. But I think that we need to learn the lessons that you all learned about how to have these conversations on the small scale. Because I think we are not real good at setting ground rules that acknowledge different people's realities, right? I mean, you said that earlier, even just, when you have two versions of the same truth and both people experience pain from their version of the truth, we're not real good at holding that complexity, and we're not good at holding it in a congregational setting. So to think that we're going to hold it on a plenary floor, I don't know. Maybe we should try.
Yeah. Well, I think, and Michael, you and I share a history with Right Relationship, right? With the Right Relationship team. And look what's happened with that. Because I think we need to be bolder and stronger, and we need to do it at General Assembly. I think that we do have a power, and I agree with you, but I think that there are both and. I think that that the courage that the council, what became the Council on Cross-Cultural Engagement that you and I both served on, but I don't think either one of us were there in the beginning, and they set in motion a thing, a way of being together in the hardest conversations, where tears were shared in that first room, and song also, and an acknowledgement that we are not going to come up with the rule book. Everybody wanted that council to come up with, what do we sing, what do we don't sing? How do we do this? How do we do that? And what that council came up with is that there needs to be a way, a container, to have these difficult things happen, and we need to be very specific. And that's what I've sort of mourned the loss of on the GA stage, is that, and because there's this fight to be, we don't want to upset anybody, when the power and the focus should be, we want to tell the truth, the whole truth, name names, name. It occurs to me, Christina's here, so this impacts this still, right? We need to be able to say what it is that's so difficult for us to be with, and covenant that we will stay there and figure out how to share it all. And so I've watched us make, and you were part of making that happen, Michael, and ARE too. I watched us be able to do that, and I watched the fight back about it. It's like, well, let's not be specific. It's like, no, actually, we have to be specific, but there's a respectful container that we can create to do it. So I don't know what it exactly looks like at GA. I can't even imagine. I couldn't tell this story quickly in the time of this show, but there has to be a commitment to being, or maybe it's developing resources so this could. And one of the things I learned along the way with this is that the Jewish community, the synagogues, they have access, they can write grants, there's money available to have people who are specifically trained to just have this conversation come in and be able to do it. And so maybe we need to be putting more resources around right relationship models. About how do you have whatever your hard conversation is in your congregation. Maybe some of those things would be helpful. Or, the congregations who are struggling with, does a Black Lives Matter banner go up? Things like that. Anyway, I'll stop talking now.
Well, Christina.
I would just respond to the GA portion of it, and this is without my board of trustee hat or my secretary hat on, although of course it's hard to take those hats off. It's easy for me to take them off, it's hard for other people to see me without them on, and say that I agree that we need to have those conversations at General Assembly. I agree that we need to have them in the plenary hall, where I think we have a stumbling block, or that ableist language, where we have challenges, is that the only way currently to do that is through governance, right? So that plenary is designed around governing us. And so the only way to enter the conversation you were talking about at General Assembly was about a business resolution. And so we had to bring up a business resolution in order to have the real conversation we wanted to have, which was, what does peace in the Middle East look like, and what does justice in the Middle East look like? And when you have to couch it into governance or business terms, I think from the get-go, we're not doing it from we're not doing it certainly from a theological and value-based discussion. We're doing about divesting our investments, which we want to do that based on our values and our theology. But the mechanisms that we're trying to use to hold those conversations, to me, don't feel spiritually based. And so I think that's where the challenge is, because I absolutely think we need to name names, name the truth, name the multiple truths, and name the facts. And so that was actually what I was going to invite you to talk a little bit about, because I heard you say a couple of times, the multiple truths that sit in the room. And I think sometimes people confuse that with that we're saying that there's multiple facts that sit in the room. And I think people, you know, who don't come from a culture of multiple truths, which I do, have a hard time differentiating between those two. So I wonder if you can speak to a little bit about that.
Sure, and I think that is one of the things that makes it easy for the forces that want to shut things down to happen. And so let's see. So as an example of that, one of the rabbis wanted us, you know, because they said, well, maybe we can sort of think about something we can do in the future, because people wanted us to show a next film that would somehow balance it completely. And it was like, we're actually not looking to do that. We, you know, we do have a point of view, and that is showing this fact. And so from my perspective, this movie shows the facts of how CNN coverage, for example, looks like on this issue here, and here's how it looked like in the UK. Why is this so different? And so that was a fact, right? And that's what the producer kept trying to show. He says, like, yeah, well, I do have an agenda. I want to show how this narrative is shaped and controlled, because here are some factual things. And then the opposition per se on that night that wanted us not to show this, they wanted to talk about the facts of when certain bombs went in to Israel. And those are both truths, right? You know, it's a scary place to be. And those are both facts, but how do we make places for us to look at all of the different facts? So when I say differing truths, I'm not talking about things like that's red and that's white, and we're both looking at the same thing. It's that this is true and this is also true. And so, and that's coming to not haunt us, but we're actually looking and going through the process about Black Lives Matter now. And the task force in town, the Task Force Against Discrimination, actually pulled out their support of us having Chris Crass come to town, where they were going to support us before, and that just meant we got the high school for free. They pulled out because they were against us showing this film, which is a whole nother thread that we won't get into. I'm still in conversation with them about that. But they were against us showing it, and Black Lives Matter has a position on Palestinian rights, and Chris Crass is connected to Black Lives Matter. And so we should not, as the task force, support this. And so those are multiple truths, different truths too, right? Black Lives Matter is one thing and supports this. And so I don't know that I'm answering you, Christina. I realize I just took myself down yet another rabbit hole on this, and that's what this issue felt like. But in terms of this event, I had conversations, almost all of the Jewish members of the congregation that I serve, so UCM, were very supportive and grateful that we were doing this, and became engaged and spoke up in the papers and said, you know, how can you call me anti-Semitic? And this is painful and all this. And there were two members that had a harder time with it. And one of them, I really wanted to understand what it was. And one of the comments that she offered me is that we don't care about this issue. We care about the Israel existing. So from her, and it was really helpful, from her perspective, Israel existing is the thing that's most important, and the facts that impact that are the facts that are most important to her because of the genocide of the Holocaust, and because there's a belief that if Holocaust came again, this thing called Israel is the only safe place I can be. So my facts are that if you're attacking that, you're anti-Semitic because you're not protecting that reality for me. And so I think that was the most confusing piece. And again, a piece of what's the process that allows us to have that present, and the real soulful piece of that. You need to care about my existence in the room, along with these horrible things are being done by the Israeli government against Palestine people, including children, because that's a fact too, and it's a documented fact. I don't know that I answered you. I'm sorry.
You did, absolutely. Because I think it's actually one of the things that our congregations are struggling with is, in particular right now, we are in an unprecedented moment in the lives of religious professionals of color in our congregations. And, you know, we're getting word of multiple separations and multiple instances of religious professionals of color, you know, really struggling in our ministries. And so often what we hear from congregants is, you know, they want the facts. They want to know what to believe and who's, you know, they're hearing multiple versions of the truth, and they want to know what to believe. And it's so hard to explain that this person's truth is their truth, and to them that is, you know, their experience of what happened, and you can't discount that just because somebody else's experience of that fact, of that separation, of that event, because an event can be factual, is different. And so we don't have to have this either or. We have to decide how we want to move through that, right, that situation. But it almost becomes like this value, this deep-seated, value-based place where people just want to be right and to know who was right and who was wrong. And that place in the middle just seems so hard for people to live in. And so that seems like a lot of what you're describing is that place in the middle.
Yeah, it is. And this gets back to the history of the Council on Cross-Cultural Engagement, who sat with, it was the music directors and it was the, Michael, help me. So it was, drum leaders. So drum leaders, the music director, so UUMN and ARE and the moderator in the same room talking about an experience that happened at General Assembly that different people experienced it different ways. And there was such pain in the room. And truly what everybody looked to that group for, because I later sat on it in my role as ARE president for years, was like, just tell us what to do and what not to do. And it's like, that's not ever going to happen. But what we can do is create this space. I mean, one of the things it did was parse through as an exercise on the assembly floor, plenary floor, was "We'll Build a Land." And there are people who are so upset because we ruined that hymn forever. And there are others that were like, oh my gosh, this is mind blowing. How can we take this back to our congregation? And there were others who are like, well, I want to sing it and I don't want to sing it. And there was never ever going to be, you should never sing this hymn again for this reason. It was about, you need to be aware that this carries pain for some people. And you need to be aware that contextualizing it can change that. And you need to be aware that you should have conversation space available afterwards. It's that same thing. And I think that that's where our great opportunity is. And that gives me hope.
It absolutely does. And I'll just phrase the one thing, that the caveat that I always put to this, which isn't to say that people can have multiple truths and not be responsible for the pain that they inflict. Like, that's not what the multiple truths narrative means, is that, oh, we just all say, oh, well, you know, my truth is different from your truth, and I don't have to be responsible for whatever, you know, catastrophic thing I just caused in your life.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. Yeah, absolutely.
I think that, that we learned from that council experience, which, you know, also included ministers and religious educators and members of the GA Planning Committee, was that before it came to GA, before we started this larger GA conversation, the smaller group had to learn how to have the conversation, right? So these folks struggled. The folks who first sat on that committee, they struggled to be able to have the conversation. By the time you and I were on that commission, we'd figured out how to have the conversation, right? So once we figure out how to have the conversation, then you can bring it to the GA stage. I think that the board and the tri-moderator team at the last General Assembly did some really courageous, interesting things in terms of modeling how to have some difficult conversations right there on the plenary stage. Right? Like, okay, we're going to sit on the plenary stage and we're going to have this conversation, and it's unscripted, and we don't know exactly how this conversation is going to go, but we're all committed to how we have this conversation. And they weren't all the most fabulous things I've ever heard in my life at General Assembly, but they were really, they were taking what's appropriate to be done in this governance space to a new level that I very much appreciated. And I think that this kind of conversation about Israel and Palestine needs to be at that level. We need to bring people together who are committed to how to have the conversation without knowing what the outcome of that conversation is going to be.
Yeah, and I really appreciate, Christina, you're lifting up the governance piece, because when I think of plenary, that's what I think of, is a governance session. And one thing we haven't talked about is historic trauma, which is carried by many communities, including Jewish survivors, whose ancestors were murdered in the Holocaust, including Palestinians. And so you add trauma to the mix, and then you turn it into an intellectual ration. It just doesn't work. And so I think this is such a sensitive conversation. And Wendy, I could even pick up some trauma for you in the assaults that came onto you in this moment, but that's an experience you can put a circle around, but for a lot of people, it's their whole life, that trauma. And so to really think about how to acknowledge and include historic trauma as we have these complicated conversations, which some of us are not traumatized by. And so we don't even get it that the person that we're talking to is coming from a framework of surviving or, just from a completely different worldview. So I would love to, I think, Michael, you're really right that figuring out in some small places how to have this. And so that's why I'm so grateful for you coming and sharing your congregation story. Twinkle Marie Manning also said, thank you for your impeccable example of courageously modeling our first principle. And I'm sure you didn't feel impeccable all the time, but it is inspiring to me that you didn't back down, because I think it's easy to think, oh, conflict is painful, I'm going to back away from it, instead of, wading in the water, instead of getting in there into the, as everybody's been saying, into the mess of actual living in this time. So, yeah, thank you. And I'm just, I think that the conversation here, I hope we'll hear from other congregations that are also have, I don't know, I mean, you reached out about your experience or I wouldn't have known about it. And I think learning from each other is really important. Yeah, so I'm really grateful. I've learned a lot.
Thank you. And the story, I know that be looking toward Cambridge later on in March, they're showing the movie. This was unprecedented in terms of the level of hate that was sent our way. We know that from the producer and the directors, but that's not to say that this isn't the new bar that has been set for when it's shown. And so I know that I'll be looking at Cambridge to see how we can support them. I think it's March 26 or something like that. And also, if anybody's interested in sort of the more coherent story, it now appears, thanks to the courage of UU Mass Action, and has clips from other people and some of the language that was used, and a clip from the executive producer as well. And I think you have the link for that. It's out on YouTube. It's called, I think, The Road to Beloved Community, a Congregation's Commitment to Civil Discourse, or something like that.
We will be posting that. The invisible person behind the chalice, Jessica, will be posting that. So
thank you.
Yeah, Christina, you got more to say? You always. I'm like, what else you got there? That was.
Well, I just, I really appreciate you, like Meg said, coming and sharing this with us, because I really wasn't aware of what was going on until afterwards. And I think that says something about our covenant with one another congregationally, that we need to be looking out for each other a little bit in a more intentional way, and that our mutual accountability to each other in that covenant of, you know, our principles, I can absolutely see how you all would have felt very alone, and that concern, that part of what you shared, kind of moving forward, makes me think, you know, what are the ways in which we need to strengthen those bonds between our congregations, because we're the Association of Congregations. People forget that part of the UUA. It's the Association of Congregations, and so how do we foster that that accountability between congregations to show up for one another?
And that's a piece of the Cambridge platform that we're not quite as committed to. I want to be very clear in saying that when I did the whole, hey, colleagues, we've got these people who are trying to trash our rating and who were trashing our rating on Facebook and Google. I need you. People showed up and wrote wonderful things. But again, I think I agree with you. I think that we need a way, because when you're in the trauma and in the operational mode of just trying to get, like, how are we going to do this, you know, you need some easy way to say help. But I did hear from our district, and it was one quiet email to say, we're with you. And I got to say, that felt like a very quiet, we're with you. So I think that we have growth to do. These are all good people involved in this on all sides. So thank you. And thank you for having this. And Meg says, does UUJME lead trips to the Middle East?
Dana Ashrawi asked if there might be annual trips to study the situation and relate it to our theology and our sources. And I was thinking that there have been trips from the whole association to the Middle East, but I don't know who's done them lately. I mean, a lot of people go with local groups too.
An unexpected outcome, I think, from Mr. Lappin's intense efforts. There's one as the executive producer thanked him because many more people are seeing this film than would have otherwise. And the other piece is I'm looking to go on one of those trips. And so if people are interested, I know I'm asking the UJME and others in this Jewish Voices for Peace, what's a trip that would allow me to see the more full, because I'd like to know the stories from myself firsthand rather than through others as well. So
yeah, I think this is maybe having a commission, which could become the small group that's actually processing that then could create something to bring. Dana says, thank you, Dana. UUJME does organize trips about every other year. UU Christian Fellowship had one. Interfaith Peace Builders does trips many times per year. I know lots of folks who have been there, but I think you're saying maybe something more structured to bring this conversation to the whole movement. And I think that's really interesting. We are coming to the end of our time. Wendy, is there anything you wish you'd said that you didn't get to say?
No, just thank you so much for doing this.
It's wonderful to have you here. Thank you for your courage and the story. And I want to mention that next week, we're going to have the UU College of Social Justice come and talk about trips to borderlands. And they're going different places. It'll be really interesting to hear about them. Also should have mentioned at the beginning that Aisha's not here. She was up all night with a kid. She emailed us all at like 3 a.m. with a sick kid. So we're hoping that her child is better now and that she is sleeping. Any other parting words, Wendy or Christina or Michael?
Just a note, not related to this conversation, but on behalf of everyone who kissed their child and put them on a school bus this morning, my heart breaks with you. So,
amen. Amen. We said at the beginning, you sort of run out of stuff to say at some point, besides just, oh, come on. So yeah. And those with young kids, yeah, our hearts do break, all of us. Thanks, everyone. See you next week.